Geopolitical confrontations possessing the capacity to fundamentally alter established power structures do not initiate through spontaneous verbal exchanges. They commence at highly specific, mathematically calculated coordinates of space and time. The precise geographic coordinate for this specific event was room 226, located within the Dirksen Senate office building. The temporal coordinate logged into the official congressional record was July 9th, 2025. The formal parameter of the gathering was a Senate Judiciary Committee oversight hearing, structurally designed to audit the operational protocols of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. However, the actual undeclared objective of this specific proceeding centered entirely on the archival records of the January 6th Select Committee records that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently auditing, revealing massive, unaccounted-for data voids. Positioned at the absolute focal point of the chamber was the primary witness table. Former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi had been formally summoned to occupy this space. She entered the acoustic environment deploying a physical interface engineered for maximum power projection. Her visual parameters included a pristine ivory suit and pearl earrings. Her spinal alignment and the deliberate calculation of her visual focus physically manifested the biological posture of an individual who had spent 37 continuous years exercising absolute control over every room she inhabited. However, the projection of total executive confidence was mathematically subverted by a singular physical anomaly positioned immediately behind her. The individual occupying the secondary chair was not a standard legislative aide or a congressional chief of staff. The individual was a specialized criminal defense attorney deployed from the law firm of Williams and Connolly. Within the rigid ecosystem of Washington politics, the selection of legal representation functions as a highly accurate, quantifiable metric. A political entity does not retain the firm of Williams and Connolly to manage public relations vulnerabilities or to navigate minor administrative infractions. An entity only summons this specific organization when there is a calculated mathematical probability of severe federal criminal exposure. The silent physical presence of this attorney broadcasted the exact reality that the former speaker's mouth would spend the subsequent 8 minutes attempting to overwrite. Positioned exactly 4 feet away, occupying the adjacent witness table, sat the active director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Kash Patel. He maintained a visual interface operating in total opposition to the ivory suit. He wore a dark suit, notably lacking a necktie. The absence of the necktie did not register as a wardrobe malfunction. It registered as a retained behavioral artifact from his previous operational tenure as a public defender in Miami-Dade County. Within that specific high-attrition judicial environment, neckties were functional identifiers reserved exclusively for state prosecutors, while public defenders wore whatever garments permitted them to physically survive a consecutive 14-hour operational shift. Resting precisely on the wooden surface in front of Director Patel was a singular object. It was a black folder. It contained 0 external labels or identifying markers. Its physical depth corresponded exactly to the mass required to contain 5 distinct items of physical evidence. It contained absolutely nothing else. Even before the audio recording matrix within room 226 was fully activated, Nancy Pelosi executed a preemptive tactical decision. She calculated that the optimal defensive protocol within this specific environment was an immediate, high-velocity verbal execution. She initiated a continuous acoustic assault lasting exactly 8 minutes, dedicating the entirety of that temporal window to systematically classifying Kash Patel as an unqualified, illegitimate operator. She established her baseline authority by injecting quantitative data into the record. She stated her 37 continuous years of congressional service. She cited her operational history alongside 7 previous Federal Bureau of Investigation directors, explicitly naming Robert Mueller, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, and Christopher Wray. Following the vocalization of each individual name, Pelosi generated a highly calibrated mechanical pause. These acoustic gaps were not biologically necessary for pulmonary function. They were engineered to generate physical mass. Each name was dropped into the airspace like a concrete block, systematically constructing a rigid perimeter designed to permanently isolate Patel from the institutional legitimacy of the agency he commanded. Establishing direct eye contact for the first time, she fired the terminal assessment. She stated that he was not in their company. The verbal bombardment systematically increased in hostility. She utilized the microphone to formally classify the active director as a political operative operating inside a law enforcement costume. She introduced his authorship of a children's book into the record, defining the publication not as public service, but as the behavior of a subordinate courtier drafting fairy tales to flatter a political patron. When the final syllable of the sustained assault concluded, Pelosi shifted her biological mass backward against her chair and executed a micro-adjustment of her eyewear. In the kinetic language of elite political combat, this specific physical gesture transmits a highly encrypted signal. The offensive sequence is terminated, the floor is relinquished, and the target is expected to fail. At the adjacent table, Kash Patel maintained a state of absolute kinetic zero. This was not the biological paralysis of a target suffering from concussive shock. This was a highly specialized operational stillness forged through thousands of hours inside municipal courtrooms. In that environment, the state prosecution perpetually commands the acoustic volume and the financial resources. The singular tactical advantage retained by the defense is patience, the learned capability to sit completely motionless while a louder entity constructs a fabricated narrative and to subsequently stand and structurally demolish that narrative using nothing but physical evidence. What Pelosi's operational matrix failed to calculate during her 8-minute projection of power was a critical data variable. She operated without the knowledge that the individual seated 4 feet away had dedicated the preceding 48 hours to the physical recovery of 14 boxes of evidence materials that her own committee had subjected to deletion protocols. She confidently classified him as an operative wearing a costume, but she neglected a fundamental law of physical reality. That specific costume contained pockets, and those pockets were currently loaded with the exact data streams she believed had been successfully incinerated. Patel precisely measured the temporal delay. He waited exactly 3 seconds after the acoustic decay of Pelosi's final sentence. Then, his right hand engaged the black folder and broke the seal. When his vocal cords engaged, the frequency was strictly calibrated to the Federal Bureau of Investigation briefing standard. This is the highly specialized acoustic profile utilized by field agents when presenting terminal evidence to a director immediately prior to authorizing a kinetic raid. The sentence structure was truncated. It was devoid of emotional filler or rhetorical embellishment. Every word was selected and deployed with the exact mechanical precision of a sniper locking in a firing coordinate. He acknowledged the resume, citing the 7 directors and the 37 years of service, logging it as impressive. He then altered his visual trajectory, looking directly down at the open folder. He established his own timeline, noting his 5 months as director, but establishing a much longer operational history of investigative work. He stated that during his 5-month tenure, his field agents had successfully recovered specific material. He elevated his visual focus, locking directly onto the former speaker. He identified the material explicitly as data she believed was destroyed. And as the director's hand physically turned to the first page of the ledger, the structural integrity of Washington's primary containment vessel suffered a catastrophic breach, pushing room 226 into a sequence from which there was no mathematical possibility of retreat. The acoustic environment of room 226 was permanently altered the moment Director Kash Patel turned the first page of the black folder. He did not initiate his presentation with an accusation. He initiated it with a classification protocol. Item 1, Patel stated. He read the header utilizing the exact phonetic cadence of a federal evidence clerk processing an exhibit number. The delivery was entirely flat, stripping the data of any political context and reducing it to its raw procedural baseline. It was the vocal equivalent of applying a received stamp to a legal document. He proceeded to read the title of the document into the congressional record: Federal Bureau of Investigation Forensic Financial Analysis. Cross-reference of Pelosi household trading activity with the House legislative calendar, period. January 2019 through December 2024. Patel elevated his visual focus. He did not direct his gaze at the former Speaker of the House. He locked his visual trajectory directly onto the seated senators occupying the committee bench, the specific individuals possessing formal subpoena power and the institutional capability to act upon the incoming data stream. He began to deploy the quantitative metrics. He stated that the Forensic Accounting Unit had successfully identified 47 individual market trades executed by the Pelosi household. These transactions were primarily routed through Financial Leasing Services, the venture capital firm operated by Paul Pelosi. The critical data point was not the existence of the trades, but their specific temporal coordinates. Patel confirmed that each of these 47 transactions, whether initiating a buy position or executing a sell order, occurred within exactly 14 calendar days of a highly specific legislative event. The events were quantified as a committee vote, a floor vote, or a federal regulatory announcement that directly and immediately altered the valuation of the specific security being traded. He executed a mechanical pause, 47 perfectly correlated trades across a 5-year temporal window. Patel turned the page, shifting from the macroscopic data to the microscopic forensic case studies. He offered the committee the verified highlights. He isolated the temporal coordinate of June 2021. During this specific month, Paul Pelosi initiated the purchase of NVIDIA call options, investing capital totaling between $1 million and $5 million. The forensic timeline demonstrated that mere weeks following this massive capital allocation, the CHIPS and Science Act, a massive federal bill containing $280 billion in semiconductor subsidies, officially advanced to the floor of the House of Representatives. Patel mapped the operational architecture of this sequence. Nancy Pelosi, acting in her official capacity as Speaker, maintained absolute operational control over the floor schedule. She solely determined the exact temporal coordinate when the subsidy bill would be subjected to a vote. Her spouse executed the acquisition of the corresponding stock options immediately prior to that mathematically guaranteed timeline. Patel maintained an unchanged vocal delivery as he shifted to the second case study. He established the timeline at July 2024. During this month, Paul Pelosi executed a sell order liquidating exactly 2,000 shares of the financial corporation Visa. Exactly 2 months later, in September 2024, the United States Department of Justice officially filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against Visa, alleging monopolization of the debit card market. The public announcement of the federal lawsuit triggered an immediate vertical drop in the security's valuation. The Pelosi household had successfully extracted their capital exactly 60 days before the lawsuit became a matter of public record. Patel turned another page, increasing the velocity of the data stream. He listed the corporate entities: Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, CrowdStrike. He documented that each individual trade was executed within a margin of days prior to regulatory actions, closed-door committee hearings, or massive government contract announcements that directly impacted the share price of those specific entities. He synthesized the sequence. This was not a singular occurrence. It was not a dual occurrence. It was a verified sequence executed 47 individual times. Setting the document down upon the table, Patel introduced the ultimate mathematical metric into the chamber. He stated that the statistical probability of 47 coincidental timing correlations occurring organically within a 5-year period, as calculated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation Forensic Accounting Unit, is exactly 1 in 3.2 million. To ensure the Legislative Committee accurately processed the magnitude of this algorithm, he provided a comparative physical baseline. He stated that the odds of a human biological asset being struck by lightning within a given calendar year are 1 in 1,222,000. Therefore, An individual is mathematically more likely to be struck by lightning twice than to execute 47 consecutive stock trades that perfectly align with their spouse's highly classified legislative calendar. Furthermore, Patel noted a critical divergence in the probability matrix. Unlike randomized lightning strikes, every single one of these 47 trades operated exclusively in the profitable direction. Patel then shifted his physical orientation, rotating his upper body to face Nancy Pelosi directly. He methodically dismantled her standard public defense protocol. He acknowledged that when previously confronted regarding these market transactions, she had consistently deployed the identical verbal shield. She stated that she does not own any individual stocks, that her husband makes those financial decisions independently, and that she does not direct him to execute any buy or sell orders. Patel conceded that this specific statement might be technically accurate. However, he immediately introduced the operational protocol utilized by federal law enforcement. He explained that when the Bureau investigates financial crimes, the objective is not solely to identify the individual who physically pressed the button to execute the trade. The primary objective is to identify the individual who possessed the classified information prior to the trade. He mapped the information flow. The individual who possessed absolute control over the House floor schedule, the individual who determined the exact date the Semiconductor Subsidy Act would face a vote, the individual who physically occupied secure facilities during classified briefings concerning national security and domestic technology regulation. That specific individual shared a residential dinner table with the individual executing the trades. Patel clarified the legal threshold. The prosecution is not required to produce an audio recording of a phone call directing a spouse to buy NVIDIA stock. The prosecution is only required to establish that highly sensitive data traveled from one side of a domestic structure to the other. Within the framework of federal financial law, this specific transmission matrix is classified as a tipper-tippy relationship, and achieving 47 perfect correlations operating against 1 in 3.2 million odds is what federal prosecutors formally classify as an unbreakable behavioral pattern. To finalize the presentation of Item 1, Patel executed a final calculation of the household's capital accumulation. He noted that the net worth of the Pelosi household was evaluated at $20 million when she assumed the office of Speaker in the year 2007. He contrasted that baseline with the current estimated valuation of $240 million. Operating on a standard government salary of $174,000 annually, the household had achieved a total capital expansion of 1,200%. He provided one final baseline for the committee to process. He noted that Warren Buffett, universally recognized within the financial sector as the most successful capital allocator in history, achieved an average annual return of 20% over a 60-year period. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had mathematically verified that a civil servant operating out of Washington had generated capital returns considerably higher than the greatest investor in history, while operating with a level of transparency that registered at absolute zero. At the adjacent table, the physical posture of the former speaker underwent a severe involuntary alteration. Her spinal column straightened vertically. This movement was not a projection of confidence. It was the absolute biological reflex of defense. It was the physical manifestation of a high-value target adhering to the strict parameters issued by her legal counsel prior to the hearing. Sit up straight, maintain rigid control, and under no circumstances initiate verbal communication. Her jaw muscles engaged, clamping down visibly. While this muscular contraction was partially obscured from the primary viewing gallery, it was perfectly captured by camera 2, which was mechanically angled to record the witness table in sharp profile. Her visual focus broke. She did not look at Director Patel. She did not look at the Legislative Committee. Her eyes darted laterally, locking onto the individual seated immediately behind her, the attorney from Williams and Connolly. The visual contact was sustained for precisely 1 second. It was an encrypted transmission communicating a singular inquiry. Is this the scenario we engineered our defensive parameters to withstand? The facial architecture of the criminal defense attorney transmitted absolutely nothing in return. Elite defense counsel are heavily trained to maintain a facial interface devoid of all data, regardless of the severity of the incoming kinetic strike. Operating as a blank surface in the face of catastrophic exposure is the primary requirement of their profession. Item 1 had been fully entered into the operational record, and the black folder still contained 4 additional files. The transition between the first and second items within the black folder was executed without rhetorical hesitation. Director Kash Patel did not allow the acoustic environment to process the magnitude of the financial data before introducing the next variable. He simply turned the page, maintaining the exact procedural cadence utilized in the previous sequence. Item 2, Patel stated. Recovered email metadata. Source, House Sergeant-at-Arms server backup. Period. January 3rd through January 7th, 2021. The introduction of those specific temporal coordinates triggered an immediate, observable, physiological shift within the legislative chamber. The mechanical climate control systems regulating the Dirksen building do not respond to spoken testimony, but human biology consistently does. The dates spanning January 3rd to January 7th represent a highly specific operational window. Every individual occupying a seat within room 226 possessed an absolute understanding of the kinetic events that transpired precisely in the center of that timeline. On January 6th, Patel proceeded to define the exact nature of the digital evidence. He clarified that the digital forensics team had not recovered the internal text of the emails themselves. They had recovered the metadata. In the architecture of digital investigations, metadata functions as the indestructible footprint of an electronic action. It provides the exact, verified logs demonstrating when specific communications were transmitted, when they were received, when they were physically opened by the recipient, and crucially, the exact microsecond they were deleted from the server. The specific account targeted by this forensic extraction belonged to Paul Irving, the individual occupying the position of Sergeant-at-Arms during that temporal window. Patel explicitly established the structural chain of command for the official record. The Sergeant-at-Arms is a position directly appointed by the Speaker of the House, and consequently, the operational chain of command runs directly through the Speaker's central office. Reading directly from the forensic log, Patel detailed the transmission sequence. Exactly 3 emails were transmitted from the account of Sergeant-at-Arms Irving to the direct inbox of the Speaker's Chief of Staff between the dates of January 3rd and January 5th, 2021. The metadata confirmed that all 3 individual transmissions contained the identical word in the subject line, guard. Patel mapped the subsequent digital interactions. The server logs verified that all 3 emails were successfully delivered. Furthermore, the metadata generated specific read timestamps, confirming that the communications regarding the National Guard were physically opened and reviewed by the receiving office prior to the perimeter breach on January 6th. He then delivered the terminal data point of the sequence. The server logs confirmed that all 3 specific emails were manually deleted from Irving's account. The exact date of this coordinated deletion was January 7th, 2021. Patel elevated his visual focus from the document, locking his trajectory onto the committee. He summarized the forensic timeline. 3 official communications concerning the deployment of the National Guard were transmitted and read before the catastrophic security failure. Exactly 24 hours after the security failure occurred, those specific communications were systematically erased. They were not archived into the permanent congressional record. They were not forwarded to any internal security review board. They were not preserved for any subsequent federal investigation. They were deleted. To contextualize this digital erasure, Patel introduced the sworn testimony of Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund. The objective historical record confirms that Chief Sund explicitly requested the preemptive deployment of National Guard assets prior to January 6th. The Sergeant-at-Arms, functioning as the direct appointee of the Speaker, formally denied that request. The stated justification for the denial, verified by multiple operational sources, was based entirely on visual optics. The physical presence of National Guard troops stationed at the perimeter was calculated to be visually unacceptable. Patel looked directly at Nancy Pelosi. He noted that when the physical perimeter was breached on January 6th and Chief Son transmitted a secondary emergency request for National Guard assistance, the formal authorization required over 1 hour to process. This delay occurred because the authorization request was mandated to travel vertically through a chain of command that inherently included the Speaker's office. He then introduced the secondary component of Item 2. He pivoted from digital server logs to primary source audio-visual recordings. He cited specific footage recorded on camera by the Speaker's own daughter, Alexandra, originally captured for a documentary produced by the HBO network. Patel read exact phonetic transcriptions from that recording into the congressional ledger. In the footage, Nancy Pelosi states, "I take responsibility for not having them just prepared for more." Furthermore, she states, "Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?" Patel allowed the two quotations to suspend in the acoustic environment of the chamber. He categorized them procedurally. They were both direct admissions of executive responsibility. They were both recorded on high-definition film, and they were both systematically suppressed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation possessed verification that this footage existed solely because Chairman Loudermilk had executed a direct acquisition from the HBO network. The footage was not acquired from the designated Select Committee. It was not acquired from the National Archives. Patel mapped the structural hypocrisy of the suppression. The Select Committee, explicitly created to investigate the security failures of January 6th, consumed $20 million in taxpayer capital. It conducted interviews with over 1,000 individual witnesses. It executed nationally televised oversight hearings and generated formal criminal referrals against a former chief executive. Yet, this identical committee possessed primary source footage of the Speaker of the House formally admitting responsibility for the perimeter failure, and they deliberately chose not to release it to the public, not to include it within their final printed report, and not to archive it for the permanent historical record. He summarized the sequence with absolute mechanical precision. She took responsibility in a private environment while denying it in the public environment. She constructed a multi-million-dollar committee to officially assign blame for a security failure that she had already admitted on camera was her own operational responsibility. The committee suppressed the video evidence, and the digital emails concerning the National Guard were deleted exactly 24 hours after the breach occurred. Looking directly at the Legislative Committee, Patel introduced a formal law enforcement classification. He stated that when a subject makes a direct admission of fault in one specific context while aggressively denying it in another, and when that same subject simultaneously destroys communication logs and suppresses physical evidence of their own statements, the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigns a specific terminology to the pattern. The terminology is consciousness of guilt. Patel clarified that this is not a final legal conclusion. It is a primary investigative indicator. He verified its existence within the procedural architecture of the agency, noting that it is explicitly defined on page 114 of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Behavioral Analysis Manual. He confirmed this data point by stating he had reviewed the manual immediately prior to entering the hearing. At the primary witness table, the biological posture of Nancy Pelosi underwent a secondary, highly significant alteration. Her hands, which had previously rested firmly upon the surface of the table, initiated a slow, deliberate movement downward. They slid off the wooden edge and descended into her lap, entirely removing themselves from the visual field of the recording cameras. In the behavioral analysis of political figures operating under extreme duress, the positioning of the hands is a primary metric. Hands resting visibly upon the table surface project a posture of openness and sustained control. When a witness's hands drop below the table during a high-stakes congressional hearing, it translates to a singular biological reality. The subject has ceased attempting to project an image of executive composure and has fully transitioned into a psychological state of survival. Hands hidden in the lap signify that the individual is physically holding on to their own structure to prevent a visible collapse. Seated immediately behind her, the criminal defense attorney from Williams and Connolly detected the kinetic shift. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance, and delivered a whispered transmission directly into her acoustic range. One word, maybe two. It was a highly calibrated legal directive instructing the client to provide the absolute minimum verbal response required to satisfy the procedural environment without generating additional liability. Pelosi responded with a singular physical gesture. She executed a sharp, highly compressed micro-shake of her head. This movement was the biological manifestation of an internal system failure. It was the physical reaction of a political operator who had been explicitly instructed to maintain silence and who, for the first time in 37 years of consecutive legislative warfare, was actively fighting her own dominant instinct to override her legal counsel. For 37 years, that specific instinct to attack, to dominate the acoustic space, to command the narrative, had won every single engagement. But in room 226, that instinct finally intersected with raw, unalterable physical evidence. And the mathematical weight of the evidence was significantly heavier. The micro-shake concluded. She adhered to the directive. She did not engage her vocal cords. She did not respond. Item 2 was sealed into the permanent record, and Director Patel reached for the third document. The transition between the second and third items within the black folder was executed with absolute mechanical efficiency. Director Kash Patel did not allow the acoustic environment of room 226 to process the magnitude of the deleted National Guard data. He simply executed the physical turn of the page, maintaining the exact procedural cadence utilized in the preceding sequences. Item 3, Patel stated, his vocal delivery remaining flat and entirely devoid of rhetorical fluctuation. Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Network Mapping. Subject: Pelosi Family Financial Connections. Period. 2007 to present. Patel elevated his visual focus, bypassing the former speaker and locking his trajectory directly onto the seated committee. He formally classified the incoming data stream as preliminary. He stated that the forensic accountants attached to the Bureau were currently in the active process of mapping the complete financial network, but he possessed the authorization to enter the currently verified coordinates into the public record. He proceeded to define the primary conduit of the financial architecture. Paul Pelosi operates Financial Leasing Services, a venture capital and real estate firm geographically headquartered in San Francisco. Patel noted that the investment activity generated by this specific firm constituted the primary income stream for the household. Patel then mapped the precise intersection between public legislative power and private capital accumulation. He stated that the firm's financial activity had intersected on a minimum of 3 verified occasions with distinct corporate entities. The critical metric defining these entities was their receipt of federal appropriations directly from legislative committees that Congresswoman Pelosi either formally chaired or functionally controlled in her capacity as Speaker of the House. The director read the subsequent sequence with extreme phonetic precision. He chose each individual word utilizing the exact operational methodology of a bomb technician, deciding which specific wire to sever. He detailed the sequence. In those 3 specific case studies, the corporate entities initiated political action committee contributions directly to committees associated with the Pelosi political operation. Following the clearance of those financial contributions, the entities subsequently received federal earmarks or highly favorable committee treatment. Patel explicitly inserted a legal buffer into the record. He stated that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not formally alleging a quid pro quo transaction at this exact temporal coordinate. He stated they were officially noting a mathematical pattern that the Forensic Accounting Unit had flagged for secondary comprehensive review. Having established the data, Patel shifted his physical orientation directly back to Nancy Pelosi. He initiated a tactical counterstrike against her opening acoustic assault. He reminded the chamber that she had explicitly classified him as a political operative wearing a law enforcement costume. He offered to provide her with a precise operational definition of what a law enforcement professional actually executes. Congresswoman, he follows the money, Patel stated. He then mapped his own operational history into the record. He detailed following financial streams through active terrorist networks operating in the Middle East. He detailed following capital through massive narcotics operations positioned in South Florida during his tenure as a public defender, where he analyzed exactly how opposing state entities constructed their prosecutions. He detailed following capital allocations through the classified budgets of the intelligence community while serving on the House Intelligence Committee. He executed a mechanical pause, allowing the resume to fully register. He then stated that he was currently executing the identical protocol through the architecture of Washington. He noted the structural differences. The geographical roots are different. The shell companies utilize superior graphic logos, and the legal representation demands a significantly higher financial retainer. But the mathematical pattern remains completely identical. Money flows toward power, and power protects the flow, he stated. The accumulation of this specific data matrix finally breached the primary containment vessel. Nancy Pelosi engaged her vocal cords for the first time since the conclusion of her opening statement. Exactly 12 minutes of sustained tactical acoustic silence was abruptly terminated. The volume of her voice was significantly elevated. It was not the highly controlled, calibrated volume utilized during a standard floor speech. It was the raw, reactive, uncalibrated volume of a biological system that had been violently holding a highly pressurized substance. Mr. Director, are you accusing me of? She initiated. The sentence did not conclude. The termination of the sentence was not caused by an interruption from Director Patel. It was not caused by the presiding chairman striking the gavel. The sentence was terminated internally because Pelosi's auditory processing center recognized the exact phonetic structure of the word that was currently traveling up her trachea. The specific word forming in her throat, the specific word her tongue was actively shaping to complete the acoustic transmission was corruption. Her operational mind executed a rapid cycle calculation, vocalizing the word corruption in her own distinct voice, entering it onto the official congressional audio record, and speaking it directly into a live microphone broadcasting to the C-SPAN network would permanently place that specific word inside her own mouth. It would not belong to Patel. It would belong entirely to her. The resulting digital media clip would be universally titled, "Nancy Pelosi Says Corruption at FBI Hearing." And that specific digital artifact would circulate infinitely. She executed a hard stop at the exact midpoint of the syllable. The prefix core suffered a sudden biological death inside her throat, functionally identical to a mechanical car engine instantly cutting out. Her mouth snapped completely closed. Despite the sudden acoustic termination, every individual occupying room 226 heard the absolute shape of the word that failed to materialize. The ghost syllable hung in the airspace between the primary witness table and the director's chair, entirely visible within the specific silence where it was mathematically supposed to be. Director Patel generated zero biological reaction to the aborted transmission. He did not acknowledge the severed syllable. He did not alter the architecture of his facial muscles to form a smile. He simply reached for the black folder and executed the physical turn to the fourth page. The accumulation of the financial mapping matrix finally generated sufficient internal pressure to breach the primary containment vessel of the witness table. Nancy Pelosi engaged her vocal cords for the first time since the conclusion of her opening statement. Exactly 12 minutes of sustained tactical acoustic silence was abruptly and violently terminated. The volume of her vocal transmission was significantly elevated above the established baseline of the hearing. However, it was not the highly controlled, calibrated volume historically utilized during her standard legislative floor speeches. It was the raw, reactive, uncalibrated volume of a biological system that had been violently holding a highly pressurized substance and suddenly experienced a structural rupture. Mr. Director, are you accusing me of? She initiated, projecting the audio directly into the live microphone array. The sentence did not reach its structural conclusion. The termination of the sentence was not caused by an external interruption from Director Patel. It was not caused by the presiding chairman striking the wooden gavel to restore order. The sentence was terminated internally because Pelosi's auditory processing center recognized the exact phonetic structure of the word that was currently traveling upward through her trachea. The specific word actively forming in her throat, the specific sequence of consonants and vowels her tongue was mechanically shaping to complete the acoustic transmission, was corruption. Operating at the speed of neurological transmission, her strategic mind executed a rapid-cycle threat calculation, vocalizing the word corruption, utilizing her own distinct biometric vocal signature, entering it permanently onto the official congressional audio record, and broadcasting it directly into the live feed monitored by the C-SPAN network would yield an unrecoverable strategic disaster. By completing the phonetic sequence, she would physically place that highly radioactive word inside her own mouth. The vocabulary would no longer belong to Patel. It would be mathematically assigned to her. The resulting digital media artifact would be instantly generated, universally packaged, and permanently titled, "Nancy Pelosi Says Corruption at FBI Hearing." And that specific digital clip would circulate across global data networks infinitely, operating entirely outside of her capacity to control or suppress it. She executed a hard biological stop at the exact midpoint of the phonetic delivery. The prefix core escaped the vocal tract. The suffix ruption was violently swallowed backward down the esophagus. The syllable suffered a sudden biological death inside her throat, functionally identical to the mechanics of a heavy internal combustion engine instantly cutting out under extreme stress. Her jaw muscles engaged with maximum force, snapping her mouth completely closed to physically trap the remaining sound. Despite the sudden acoustic termination, every individual occupying the physical space of room 226 heard the absolute shape of the word that failed to fully materialize. The ghost syllable hung suspended in the airspace between the primary witness table and the director's chair. It remained entirely visible within the specific parameters of the silence where it was mathematically supposed to reside. Director Patel generated zero biological reaction to the aborted transmission. He did not shift his posture to acknowledge the severed syllable. He did not alter the architecture of his facial muscles to form a smile or a display of tactical triumph. He simply reached for the black folder, gripped the upper corner of the document, and executed the physical turn to the fourth page. To fully process the magnitude of this specific micro-event, it is necessary to project forward and analyze the subsequent telemetry generated by this exact 12-second sequence of footage. The audio-visual file containing the aborted sentence did not merely trend. It went entirely nuclear across all tracking metrics. Within a strictly monitored 48-hour temporal window, the 12-second clip accumulated exactly 39 million verified views. The primary catalyst for this massive data consumption was not theatrical drama. The catalyst was the stark, undeniable display of an involuntary biological reaction. Nancy Pelosi had absolutely no strategic intention of vocalizing the concept of corruption. The word had originated and risen from a neurological sector located far below her conscious strategy, far below her legal preparation, and far below the 37 years of heavily armored message discipline she had cultivated. It emerged directly from the specific physiological sector where the body inherently recognizes the truth that the conscious mind refuses to legally admit. Her mouth had simply initiated the physical formation of the word before her conscious brain could deploy the necessary override command to stop it. Consequently, 39 million individuals observed a highly controlled political operative experience, a total subconscious betrayal on live federal television. The network distribution of the artifact further codified its historical weight. The Fox Broadcasting Network transmitted the 12-second clip exactly 31 times within a single 24-hour cycle. The MSNBC Broadcasting Network transmitted the clip exactly 4 times, with each individual broadcast accompanied by a panel of commentators attempting to manually construct an alternative narrative, explaining why the phonetic sequence did not mean what it objectively and obviously meant. The attempts at narrative reassembly were mathematically unconvincing. The biological syllable itself was absolute and conclusive. A specialized body language analyst contracted by the CNN network to execute a forensic review of the footage, provided the definitive clinical assessment of the event. The expert concluded that the aborted word was structurally more revealing than any complete, fully articulated sentence she had ever spoken on the congressional floor. The mechanical definition provided by the expert was precise. When a human subject initiates the vocalization of a word involuntarily and subsequently terminates that vocalization voluntarily utilizing extreme physical force, it indicates a critical system lag. It means the conscious mind is desperately attempting to catch up to the reality that the unconscious mind has already processed and accepted. The subject intrinsically knows that the specific word applies perfectly to the established data matrix. The subject simply calculates that they cannot afford the political liability of saying it out loud. The ghost syllable remained suspended in the permanent record, a monument to a system that had finally lost control of its own internal containment protocols. And as the echoes of the aborted transmission faded into the ventilation system of Dirksen Room 226, Director Patel began to outline the parameters of the fourth item recovered from the ashes. Director Kash Patel allowed the ghost syllable to completely dissipate from the acoustic environment before re-engaging his vocal cords. He did not acknowledge the internal system failure that the former speaker had just experienced on live federal television. He maintained the rigid procedural cadence of an inventory clerk, gripping the upper right corner of the document and physically turning the page. Item 4. Patel stated into the microphone array. Security camera footage. Source: E-Salon, San Francisco, California. Date: September 1st, 2020. The introduction of this specific visual artifact required zero preliminary context. Every individual occupying the physical space of the Oversight Committee and millions monitoring the broadcast frequencies instantly identified the reference material. The operational data contained within the footage was an established matter of public record. Nancy Pelosi executing a transit through a San Francisco commercial facility entirely devoid of a respiratory mask. This transit constituted a direct, recorded violation of the municipal and state lockdown directives, the exact directives that she had aggressively championed in the public sector, and the exact directives that had systematically forced the closure of every competing commercial salon within the city. Patel set the primary evidence page down upon the table. For the first time during the proceeding, he altered the trajectory of his vocal projection. He did not lower his volume, nor did he inject emotional warmth into his delivery. Instead, his voice became highly directional. He bypassed the committee, bypassed the witness table, and spoke directly into the primary broadcast cameras. He aimed his transmission directly at the civilian population that lacked the classified data regarding the aftermath of the footage. He entered the identity of the biological asset into the record, Erica Kies, the legal proprietor of E-Salon. Patel mapped the operational timeline of the small business. He detailed a 12-year period of sustained capital investment, documenting its trajectory from a singular rented chair in a shared workspace to a fully operational facility maintaining 6 independent stylists and a highly cultivated client roster. When the lockdown directives were activated, Erica Kies executed total compliance. She suspended operations. She applied for federal assistance loans. She absorbed the sustained financial hemorrhage of commercial rent while generating zero operational revenue, adhering strictly to the parameters dictated by the governing apparatus. Then, on September 1st, 2020, the Speaker of the House breached that closed perimeter, operating entirely outside the parameters of the mandated health directives. The internal security camera, functioning as an objective mechanical observer, recorded the data, and Erica Kies executed a decision to release that unedited footage to the public sector. Patel quantified the precise cost of that data release. For demonstrating that the apex of the legislative hierarchy operated with absolute immunity from her own regulations, Erica Kies became the target of a coordinated retaliatory strike. She absorbed continuous death threats. She received anonymous communications threatening her physical safety and the safety of her immediate family. Her client roster suffered an immediate catastrophic contraction. Patel logged the terminal timeline. Within 6 months of the broadcast, e-Salon permanently ceased operations. Within 12 months, the proprietor was forced to entirely relocate outside the geographic boundaries of San Francisco. A 12-year capital endeavor was reduced to zero because the proprietor exposed a visual truth. He then contrasted this absolute destruction with the official defense strategy deployed by Congresswoman Pelosi. The defense consisted of exactly 4 words. I was set up. The administration generated 0 apologies. They generated 0 acknowledgement of hypocrisy. The executive response was simply to categorize the civilian proprietor as a malicious operative who had successfully tricked the third most powerful individual in the federal government. Patel reached for a secondary document, shifting the narrative from public knowledge to classified forensic accounting. He introduced an official audit executed by the Department of Government Efficiency. The temporal parameters of the audit spanned from March 2020 through June 2021. The audit focused exclusively on municipal waiver records for personal care businesses operating within San Francisco. Patel read the data point that the burn bag had failed to incinerate. He stated that exactly 4 commercial salons, all sharing the identical zip code as e-Salon, successfully obtained municipal waivers, granting them the authorization to maintain active operations during the absolute strictest phase of the federal lockdown. Erica Kies did not receive this waiver. She possessed 0 intelligence that such waivers even existed within the municipal architecture. The director then supplied the mathematical correlation. Of the 4 facilities that successfully acquired operational waivers, 100% were owned by individuals who had actively transmitted financial contributions to Democratic political committees within San Francisco County during the preceding 36 months. Patel logged the financial brackets. The contributions ranged precisely from $2,500 to $15,000. Erica Kies had transferred 0 capital to political committees. Patel formalized the equation for the committee. The commercial entity that exposed the truth was systematically neutralized. The commercial entities that maintained operational silence were permitted to remain open. The dividing line separating operational survival from total bankruptcy was not determined by health compliance. It was determined entirely by political contribution. He locked his visual focus back onto Pelosi, invoking the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. He stated that the fundamental doctrine of equal protection under the law applies to every singular biological entity, not exclusively to political donors, not exclusively to established allies, and not exclusively to those who maintain silence when the governing apparatus violates its own parameters. He concluded the assessment by noting that the system she controlled directly rewarded the facilities that supplied capital and directly executed the facility that supplied the truth. At that precise moment, the digital monitors mounted across the walls of the hearing room activated. They broadcasted a 10-second excerpt of the security footage. The fisheye lens of the camera captured the maskless transit from an elevated angle, displaying the timestamp of September 1st, 2020, glowing in the lower quadrant. Nancy Pelosi was forced to visually process her own image on the digital array. The physiological reaction she exhibited was immediate and extreme. The muscular structure of her face entered a state of maximum tension. Her lips compressed inward, retracting into the absolute thinnest configuration mathematically possible for human anatomy. This specific muscular contraction was not the manifestation of a tactical smile or the projection of silent defiance. It was the structural equivalent of an architectural brace. She was actively utilizing the muscles of her jaw to physically clamp her face together, preventing the lower quadrant of her biological interface from undergoing a total structural collapse. Simultaneously, the optical sensors of her eyes locked onto the monitor and ceased all reflexive movement. The C-SPAN broadcast network later subjected this specific sequence to a frame-by-frame analysis, confirming the exact duration. Her eyelids did not execute a single blink for exactly 8 seconds. She stared fixedly at the digital projection of a salon that no longer occupied physical space owned by a civilian who had been geographically exiled, captured during a pandemic that had systematically terminated the livelihoods of the surrounding bloc. 8 seconds of continuous optical exposure without the lubricating sweep of the eyelid generates a predictable biological sequence. It triggers the lacrimal glands. Liquid moisture began to pool visibly at the medial and lateral canthus of both eyes. These were not tears generated by emotional processing or psychological remorse. They were purely physiological tears, the mechanical byproduct of a biological system attempting to compensate for an ocular surface that was actively desiccating under the harsh artificial lighting of room 226. However, on the high-definition broadcast feed, the distinction between biological reflex and emotional collapse was virtually indistinguishable. It projected the image of a highly armored executive experiencing the physical onset of crying. At the conclusion of the 8-second sequence, the eyelids finally engaged. The blink cleared the pooled moisture, instantly erasing the final visible trace of anything resembling a vulnerable human reaction. The structural integrity of the facial mask was reestablished just as Director Patel's voice cut through the airspace to introduce the final item remaining in the black folder. The ocular moisture was successfully cleared by a singular biological mechanism. The structural integrity of the facial mask was reestablished, and the defensive posture was reset. Director Kash Patel did not allocate any temporal bandwidth to acknowledge the physiological breach that had just occurred on live federal television. He returned his vocal frequency exactly to the established evidence log cadence. The delivery was entirely cold and procedural, functioning strictly as the vocal equivalent of a federal inventory specialist preparing to permanently seal an evidence locker. Item 5, Patel stated into the acoustic environment of the chamber. The final item, the one that matters most. He elevated his visual focus from the document and locked his trajectory onto the seated committee. He initiated the sequence by establishing the baseline parliamentary procedure regarding investigative data. He stated that when the January 6 Select Committee officially dissolved at the termination of the 117th Congress, the committee staff received formal, explicit instructions to transfer the entirety of their operational materials directly to the National Archives. Patel logged this protocol as a standard operating procedure, a mandatory mechanical requirement executed by every congressional committee at the conclusion of a legislative session to guarantee that the accumulated data enters the permanent historical record of the United States. Executing a physical turn of the page, he entered the specific anomaly into the record. He detailed the results of a Federal Bureau of Investigation review, a forensic audit formally requested by the Oversight Subcommittee commanded by Chairman Loudermilk. The forensic review officially concluded that the mandatory National Archives transfer was mathematically incomplete. Patel deployed the precise quantitative metrics into the airspace of room 226. He stated that exactly 14 boxes of physical hard copy documents and an estimated volume of 40 gigabytes of digital files were entirely excluded from the National Archives transfer. He allowed the numerical values to suspend within the chamber. 14 boxes, 40 gigabytes. He explicitly clarified the classification status of the missing mass for the historical record. The absent data was not subjected to standard congressional redaction protocols. It was not formally classified by intelligence agencies, and it was not legally withheld under the established parameters of national security. It was simply missing. It was functionally erased, indicating a highly calculated decision that specific material generated by a $20 million two-year federal investigation did not require historical preservation. Patel locked his visual trajectory directly back onto Nancy Pelosi. He confirmed that the Bureau had successfully recovered a defined portion of those missing files. The recovery was executed by bypassing the primary data centers and directly accessing the backup server arrays maintained by the House Information Resources Office. He cataloged the recovered inventory, internal staff memorandums, witness interview transcripts that had never been cleared for public release, and highly sensitive digital communications flowing directly between the Select Committee and the Speaker's central office. He specifically noted that these recovered communications contain strategic directives regarding witness selection and evidence presentation strategy. He physically closed the black folder. He set the object aside on the table and folded his hands, neutralizing his own kinetic movement. He stated that the exact content of those recovered communications was currently subjected to an active Department of Justice review. This legal parameter formally prevented him from discussing the specific details within an unclassified open congressional hearing. However, he synthesized the structural reality of the situation for the committee. He stated that a legislative committee strictly engineered and funded to investigate the events of January 6th deliberately failed to preserve its own physical and digital evidence regarding January 6th. Exactly 14 boxes and 40 gigabytes were systematically vanished from the archives. And the person who created that committee, who selected its members, who defined its scope, who controlled its budget, is sitting at this witness table, Patel stated, his visual lock completely unbroken. He reminded the chamber of the $20 million in taxpayer capital consumed by the investigation, contrasting that massive financial expenditure with the 14 physical boxes of evidence that disappeared the moment the investigation concluded. He then introduced the definitive legal terminology into the airspace. He stated that in the operational vocabulary of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, when primary evidence undergoes an unauthorized disappearance following a major federal inquiry, the agency does not utilize the sanitized bureaucratic term archiving error. We call it spoliation, Patel stated. He executed a calculated tactical pause. He acknowledged that Speaker Johnson had recently introduced that exact legal term to the domestic population during the preceding week. Patel confirmed that he was now officially applying that specific criminal classification to the current data matrix. At the primary witness table, Nancy Pelosi ceased all biological movement. She did not engage her vocal cords to speak. She did not execute the mechanical function of a blink. She did not execute any micro adjustments of her eyewear. She did not shift her visual focus backward to her legal counsel. She did not scan the individuals occupying the committee bench. She completely abandoned every single kinetic maneuver, every defensive posture, and every psychological tactic she had successfully deployed across 37 continuous years of congressional hearings, legislative floor combat, and high-stakes political warfare. She sat in a state of absolute terrifying stillness. This specific physical state did not resemble the calculated tactical silence of a political operator consciously choosing to withhold a verbal response to maintain an advantage. It physically resembled the total systemic stillness of a complex, heavily armored machine that had been continuously running at maximum operational capacity for 37 years and had suddenly, without warning and without any operational ceremony, been completely unplugged from its primary power source. The internal power indicator light, the specific bioluminescence of executive authority that had remained actively illuminated since the year 1987, sustaining her biological and political systems through 2 terms as Speaker of the House, 4 distinct presidential administrations, 2 federal impeachments, a global pandemic, and a perimeter insurrection had officially gone dark. The entire acoustic and visual space of room 226 processed this biological termination simultaneously. The individuals occupying the chamber understood immediately through raw visual telemetry that they were not observing a strategic pause in an ongoing debate. They were visually confirming a structural ending. Positioned immediately behind her, the criminal defense attorney from Williams and Connolly detected the systemic collapse. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance to her auditory receptors, and delivered another whispered transmission. Unlike the previous interaction regarding the ghost syllable, Pelosi did not execute a sharp micro shake of her head. She did not execute a corresponding nod of acknowledgement. She generated absolutely zero biological reaction to the acoustic input. The attorney processed the total lack of telemetry and slowly retreated, sitting back against his chair. For the first time during the duration of the oversight hearing, and potentially for the absolute first time in the entire history of their professional legal relationship, the defense attorney possessed no further tactical advice to transmit prosebasin.com, and the client possessed zero remaining biological will to reject it. The burn bag was completely empty, and the final ledger had been irreversibly opened. The procedural presentation of the 5 items concluded. Director Kash Patel did not wait for an acoustic response from the completely immobilized figure seated 4 feet away. He initiated the terminal sequence of the oversight hearing. He executed a physical movement, reaching into the interior pocket of his dark suit jacket. He extracted his official Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials. It was the standard leather casing containing the metal badge and the photographic identification issued to every director. He elevated the badge into the visual field of the chamber. The movement was entirely devoid of theatricality. It was executed with the functional, mechanical precision of a federal agent presenting operational credentials at a physical perimeter prior to initiating a search warrant. He directly addressed the former speaker's opening assault. She had stated that the institution belonged to professionals, and she had categorized him as a courtier serving a political king. Patel placed the physical badge onto the wooden surface of the table. He stated for the permanent record that he did not serve a king, he served the badge, and the badge served the Constitution, the exact legal document she had sworn an oath to defend and subsequently utilized as a tactical weapon against every biological entity except herself for 37 continuous years. Patel mapped the exact physical parameters of the current reality. He acknowledged that she had utilized her executive power to actively attempt to bury his investigation in the year 2017. He retrieved the badge from the table and returned it to his pocket. "I'm still here, and so is the evidence," Patel stated. He locked his optical focus onto her for the final time. The spatial distance separating the 2 witness tables measured exactly 4 feet. That specific physical gap currently contained the total accumulated mass of 37 years of unyielding executive power, positioned directly against 5 months of calculated investigative patience and 5 specific physical items that were mathematically engineered to be destroyed but fundamentally were not. "Sleep well, Congresswoman," he stated, and returned to a seated position. The acoustic strike of the chairman's wooden gavel immediately followed. It was a singular, clean, kinetic impact. The sound wave traveled through the physical airspace of room 226, utilizing the exact same methodology that verified evidence travels through a federal investigation, methodically, completely, and without requesting authorization from the target. The adjournment of the hearing did not terminate the event. It merely initiated the systemic contagion. The data matrix released from the black folder breached the containment of the legislative chamber and immediately infected the macroscopic systems of Washington and the global financial networks. The quantitative probability of 1 in 3.2 million ceased to function as a localized statistic. It instantly mutated into a recognized unit of measurement across financial data networks. A financial technology corporation capitalized on the data release by engineering a specific browser extension designed to mechanically flag any congressional stock trade executed within 14 days of related federal legislation. The software was officially designated the Pelosi Alert. It generated 2 million verified downloads within its primary 30-day operational window. The visual icon program for the extension was a small lightning bolt providing a direct mechanical reference to Patel's comparative baseline. Within a 90-day timeline, the automated software successfully flagged 23 distinct trades executed by 11 active members of Congress. The targeted forensic weapon was now operating autonomously. The institutional response matched the civilian data consumption. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally activated a review of financial leasing services. The case was specifically routed to the Market Abuse Unit. This routing assignment functioned as a highly visible operational signal. It was the identical federal unit that successfully executed the criminal prosecution of Martha Stewart. Legal analysts mapping the trajectory noted that Stewart absorbed a federal prison sentence based upon a singular trade valued at $45,000, whereas the correlated trades executed by the Pelosi household were quantified in the tens of millions of dollars. Simultaneously, a comprehensive Government Accountability Office audit request was formalized, legally demanding a total financial extraction of Pelosi's entire 37-year congressional career. The legal and political hemorrhage accelerated simultaneously on multiple vectors. The Department of Justice activated its subpoena power, targeting 6 former staff members attached to the January 6th committee to locate the 14 missing boxes and 40 gigabytes of absent data. Erica Kies, the civilian salon owner, initiated a formal civil lawsuit within the Northern District of California. The legal documentation sought exact financial damages totaling $2.44 million, representing the calculated valuation of the destroyed commercial entity. The civilian population responded by transferring $890,000 in direct capital into a legal defense fund created for her benefit. The political infrastructure that had previously provided absolute protection initiated an automatic silent detachment protocol. Facing a 2026 re-election campaign at the biological age of 86, Pelosi was confronted by a 38-year-old primary challenger whose entire campaign apparatus operated under a 2-word slogan, 14 boxes. The challenger acquired $1.2 million in capital within exactly 7 days. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee executed a covert financial maneuver, quietly reallocating $400,000 in party capital directly away from Pelosi's district, transferring the resources to alternative coordinates. Furthermore, her secondary income stream suffered a total collapse. The highly lucrative speaking circuit, previously generating $100,000 per individual appearance, contracted to absolute zero. 3 distinct academic universities terminated her commencement contracts. 2 corporate boards executed silent removals of her identity from their digital architectures. The legal departments governing these organizations processed the Securities and Exchange Commission data and classified her utilizing a 2-word metric, reputational risk. The ultimate absolute verification of the systemic failure was printed on standard accounting paper. Within the first 4 months following the hearing, the criminal defense firm of Williams and Connolly generated a formal invoice for their legal services. The total capital demanded was $2.1 million. For a biological entity maintaining an estimated net worth of $240 million, a $2.1 million financial penalty is easily absorbed. The catastrophic variable was not the volume of the capital, it was the existence of the invoice itself. Nancy Pelosi had never required the services of a federal criminal defense attorney during her preceding 37 years of continuous operation. The physical generation of that invoice provided the final, undeniable mathematical proof. In the operational hierarchy of Washington, political entities do not transfer millions of dollars to Williams and Connolly to resolve administrative oversights. They transfer that capital when the mechanical destruction protocols have failed. They hire them when the burn bag did not work. The federal investigation was not terminating, it was actively initiating. The physical documents had bypassed the incinerator, the data streams had bypassed the deletion commands. The burn bag was permanently open, and the ashes were talking.